January 1943. A cold wind drifts across the tarmac of Rechlin Test, the Luftwaffe's secret test airfield in northern Germany. The morning mist clings low, swallowing the outlines of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs resting in silence. But amid the fog, another shape looms. Broad wings, a deep belly, 4 massive engines. The ground crew stop and stare. Painted hastily over its silver skin, the black cross of the Luftwaffe seems foreign, almost wrong. Beneath the markings, faded letters still show USAAF. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, once the pride of the American 8th Air Force, now wears German insignia. Its engines cough, then roar to life. The sound is unlike any German bomber, deeper, heavier, resonant. Inside, 2 Luftwaffe officers strap in, their flight suits marked with the eagle and swastika crest. They exchange a quiet glance, curiosity tempered by respect. As the aircraft begins to roll, the air vibrates with power. It was once hunted, now it hunts for knowledge. The flying fortress lifts into the gray sky, carrying with it the weight of both engineering genius and the enemy's admiration. That day, the Luftwaffe would learn something they never expected to admit. By 1943, the skies over Europe had become a second front, vast, shifting, and merciless. The Allies no longer sought just to defeat Germany's armies. They aimed to suffocate the Reich from above. Day after day, waves of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators took off from airfields across England, bound for the industrial heart of Hitler's empire. Factories in Schweinfurt, ball-bearing plants in Regensburg, oil refineries in Hamburg, each was a lifeline for German war production. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed that by severing those lifelines, the Third Reich could be forced to collapse without a single soldier landing on its soil. The doctrine behind it was bold, almost revolutionary: precision daylight bombing. While the British Royal Air Force struck cities under the cover of darkness, the Americans insisted they could hit factories by daylight, flying in massive, self-defending formations. The cornerstone of that strategy was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Designed in the 1930s as a long-range heavy bomber, the B-17 was unlike anything the world had seen. It could fly above 25,000 feet, withstand severe punishment, and still bring its crew home. But its defining feature was not speed or altitude, it was firepower. 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns bristle from the airframe, in the nose, tail, waist, and dorsal positions. Powered turrets gave the crew overlapping fields of fire. A formation of B-17s could weave a moving wall of bullets through the sky, so dense that Luftwaffe pilots described attacking them as flying into a storm of lead. To the men who flew them, it was both fortress and coffin. 10 crew members operated each bomber: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 5 gunners. They faced temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius, frostbite, oxygen starvation, and the constant rattle of flak bursting in the thin air. But when they returned, their planes often bore scars that defied belief. Holes torn through the fuselage, engines shot out, tail sections barely holding together, and yet the Flying Fortress would still fly home. For the Luftwaffe, the arrival of these massive formations presented a nightmare. Germany's early air superiority, once unchallenged over Europe, began to falter under the weight of relentless American bombing. Fighter Gruppen scrambled daily to intercept incoming raids, but the enemy seemed unending. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned that attacking a B-17 head-on or from the rear could mean instant death. Even experienced aces were forced to rethink tactics. They began developing new formations, new cannon calibers, and new aircraft like the twin-engine Bf-110 and Me-410, planes capable of carrying heavier armament to break through the bomber formations. But no matter how they tried, the B-17 kept coming. In 1942 and early 1943, as losses mounted, German intelligence became desperate to understand how these aircraft could endure such punishment. How were they constructed? How effective were their defensive systems? What weaknesses could be exploited? Soon, the opportunity presented itself. Scattered across the fields of occupied France and the Low Countries, damaged American bombers crash-landed or were forced down by engine failure. Some crews were captured. Some aircraft were remarkably intact. And to the analytical minds of the Luftwaffe's technical branches, these wrecks were treasures. Orders were issued. Any Allied aircraft downed in a recoverable condition was to be salvaged, repaired if possible, and sent to the Luftwaffe's test centers. From these machines, Germany would extract every secret it could. In the spring of 1943, one particular B-17, crippled but largely intact, was transported under heavy guard to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary flight testing facility. Mechanics worked for weeks under strict supervision, restoring the bomber to flight condition. Its bullet holes were patched with aluminum plates. Its American stars were painted over with black crosses. Inside the cockpit, German labels replaced English markings. When the engines finally started, the sound alone drew crowds. It was a foreign voice in the heart of Germany.
The unit tasked with flying captured enemy aircraft was known to few outside Germany's upper command. Its name, Zirkus Rosarius, the Rosarius Circus. Formed under the command of Theodor Rosarius, a former test pilot and flight instructor, this special Luftwaffe detachment was dedicated to a single purpose: understanding and exploiting enemy technology. The group operated under the Luftwaffe's Luftdienststelle Rechlin, and its pilots were chosen for their skill, technical knowledge, and steady nerves. Their mission was as daring as it was dangerous: to fly enemy aircraft in German skies, often still bearing original markings, and evaluate their strengths, weaknesses, and combat characteristics. Captured Spitfires, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and bombers like the B-24 and B-17 passed through their hands. Every aircraft was carefully examined, flown, and documented. Data from these tests shaped Luftwaffe tactics, training manuals, and the development of countermeasures. When the captured B-17F arrived at Rechlin in mid-1943, it instantly became the centerpiece of the unit's efforts. The aircraft had been forced down in France after flak damage crippled 2 of its 4 engines. Miraculously, it landed relatively intact in a farmer's field. The crew was captured. The aircraft was disassembled and shipped by rail to Germany. Repaired under the supervision of Flugzeugführerschule mechanics, the bomber was soon ready for testing. The Luftwaffe assigned it a new identity, DL+XC. But among the pilots, it earned a different name, Die Festung, the fortress. Before the first flight, Luftwaffe engineers meticulously examined the bomber's construction. They were astonished by what they found. The B-17's airframe, though massive, was built around a lightweight aluminum alloy skin supported by an incredibly strong internal frame. Redundancy was everywhere: dual hydraulic systems, backup control cables, and armor plating protecting vital areas like fuel tanks and crew positions. Even when riddled with bullets, the structure could remain airworthy. The Germans were equally intrigued by its armament layout. Electric-powered turrets controlled by simple hand grips, gyro-stabilized gun sights, and wide fields of fire that overlapped across every approach angle. No matter where an enemy fighter came, from above, below, or behind, at least 2 gunners could engage it simultaneously. To the Luftwaffe's analysts, it explained much of what their own pilots had reported: the eerie, impenetrable fire curtain surrounding B-17 formations. The Rosarius test pilots began with taxi tests and short flights. The bomber's handling surprised them. Despite its bulk, it responded smoothly, its control surfaces well-balanced. The 4 Wright 1820 radial engines delivered steady power, though at higher fuel consumption than German equivalents. Its climb rate was modest, but once at altitude, the bomber cruised with remarkable stability. But it wasn't just the engineering that impressed them. It was the concept behind it. The B-17 had been designed around endurance and survivability, not finesse. It was a weapon of persistence, an aircraft built to absorb punishment, to keep flying even when logic said it should fall. This philosophy contrasted sharply with the Luftwaffe's own bomber doctrine, which favored speed and precision over durability. As reports circulated through technical command, interest in the captured fortress grew. High-ranking officers, including General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, visited the airfield to witness demonstrations. During briefings, test pilots shared their observations: the comfort of the cockpit layout, the sophistication of the defensive fire control, and the resilience of its structure. Even hardened Luftwaffe veterans, men who had spent years fighting Allied bombers, found themselves quietly impressed. Some admitted that if Germany had possessed such a bomber in 1940, the war might have taken a different turn. The captured fortress was later flown to other airfields for tactical training exercises. German fighter pilots were briefed using its data: how to approach safely, where blind spots existed, and how to exploit them. Yet the conclusion was sobering. There were very few safe approaches. Every test confirmed what the Luftwaffe's frontline squadrons already suspected. Attacking a B-17 formation was a deadly gamble. And as the tests continued, another realization began to form within the German ranks, one not recorded in official reports, but spoken quietly among officers after flights. They had underestimated not just an airplane, but the industrial and engineering power behind it. Soon, their study of the B-17 would shift from admiration to necessity, as the Allied air offensive grew into something far beyond what the Luftwaffe could contain. From the cold hangars of Rechlin, the lessons of the captured fortress would ripple across the Reich's defenses and change how Germany fought in the air. The next phase would not be about curiosity anymore. It would be about survival.
The captured B-17 was more than a trophy. It was a mirror reflecting everything the Luftwaffe was beginning to lose. For the men who flew and studied it, the experience unfolded through several lenses: human, technical, and psychological. The human angle. The test pilots of Zirkus Rosarius. The pilots who climbed into the fortress were not ordinary aviators. They were engineers in flight suits, men trained to feel the personality of a machine through their fingertips. Among them was Hans Werner Lurch, one of Germany's most experienced evaluation pilots. He had flown nearly every Allied aircraft type tested in the Reich: Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lightnings, Mustangs, and now the B-17. When Lurch first sat in the pilot's seat, he was struck by its design logic. Every switch, gauge, and lever was placed within reach, labeled clearly. The controls felt solid, almost reassuring. It was made for war, he later wrote in his technical notes, for long flights, for fatigue, for men who must endure. Test pilots often found themselves torn between admiration and duty. They knew the data they collected could help shoot down Allied air crews, men not so different from themselves. Yet professionalism demanded precision, not emotion. The B-17 tests were particularly sobering. The pilots felt the aircraft's purpose in every rivet, a weapon built not for one man's skill, but for 10 men's survival. They compared it to the Luftwaffe's Henkel HE-111 or Dornier DO-17, faster perhaps, but fragile, vulnerable, easily consumed by fire. Inside the flying fortress, the Germans found something alien to their own design philosophy: redundancy. Nothing depended on a single cable or circuit. Systems overlapped, protected each other, and continued even after severe damage. It was engineering for endurance, the opposite of the Luftwaffe's refined but brittle precision. During one test flight, Lurch deliberately shut down an engine mid-air to observe stability. The fortress barely wavered. He shut down two on one side, still controllable. This machine, he noted, could bring its crew home even half dead. That realization left a lasting impression. The Germans, who had long prided themselves on technical mastery, could not deny the pragmatic genius of their enemy's design. The technical angle: anatomy of a fortress. The Luftwaffe's engineering division dissected every aspect of the B-17. The results astonished them. The first revelation was its armor. Lightweight yet strategically placed, it protected the cockpit, control lines, and fuel tanks without making the aircraft sluggish. The self-sealing tanks, layered with rubberized material, prevented catastrophic explosions from cannon hits, a feature still rare in many German bombers. The second revelation was the defensive layout. The B-17 carried an interlocking network of guns that, when flown in formation, multiplied in effectiveness. Each bomber could defend not only itself, but also its neighbors. German analysts mapped the arcs of fire across the airframe and quickly realized that the only relatively safe attack angle was from directly above or below, both extremely difficult to achieve. The chin turret, introduced on the B-17F and later improved on the B-17G, eliminated the vulnerability to frontal assaults, which had once been the preferred tactic of Luftwaffe pilots. The electric turrets themselves were a technological wonder to German engineers. Compact, responsive, and powered by separate circuits, they allowed gunners to track targets smoothly with minimal fatigue. Even the plexiglass bubbles offered wide visibility, something German bomber crews had always struggled with. Luftwaffe intelligence summarized the findings in a classified report marked Geheim. Among its conclusions was a simple but telling line: the defensive potential of this aircraft is unprecedented in the current air war. The bomber's structure was equally revealing. The Americans had used a semi-monocoque fuselage, where the outer skin contributed to strength, a method that provided exceptional rigidity without excess weight. Damage reports from downed bombers confirmed it. Even with entire sections shredded by cannon shells, many still maintained flight control. The Germans measured the bullet-resistant glass, examined the oxygen systems, and marveled at the ball turret's ingenious compactness. They even noted the crew ergonomics: padded seats, efficient heating, logical communication layouts. It was, in essence, a machine built for sustained human operation in the harshest conditions. By contrast, German bombers like the He-177 Greif, designed under intense political pressure to double as a dive bomber, suffered from structural and engine failures that often killed their own crews before reaching the target. To the Luftwaffe's engineers, the B-17 represented what their own aircraft could have been if designed under a doctrine of endurance rather than speed and efficiency. The longer they studied the flying fortress, the clearer it became that they were not just analyzing an aircraft, they were confronting an entire philosophy of war. The B-17 embodied the American belief in industrial strength, mass production, and crew survivability. Germany's own air doctrine had been shaped by swift, precise blitzkrieg tactics, a lightning war that left no room for attrition. But the war of 1943 was no longer lightning. It was becoming a storm. A battle of endurance, of machines and men who could absorb more punishment than the enemy could deliver. The Luftwaffe's fascination with the captured fortress soon turned to a grim realization. The Americans were building thousands of these machines, while Germany struggled to replace the few it lost each month. And as Zirkus Rosarius continued its tests, higher command began demanding more than admiration. They wanted answers. How to stop them? The next phase of analysis would move from study to strategy.
The Luftwaffe's fascination with the B-17 soon evolved from technical curiosity to tactical urgency. The fortress was no longer just an engineering marvel, it was a problem that demanded a solution. The tactical angle, learning how to kill a fortress. In early 1943, the Luftwaffe's Fighter Command convened a series of classified briefings based on the findings from Rechlin. The intelligence was blunt. Traditional interception tactics were failing. Attacking from the rear, the instinctive approach placed German fighters directly in the path of multiple .50 caliber guns. The tail, waist, and dorsal turrets could unleash a torrent of fire so dense that even experienced aces hesitated to press home their attacks. The new recommendation, drawn from tests with the captured B-17, was counterintuitive: attack from the front. Approaching head-on gave only a few seconds of engagement, but those seconds mattered. German analysts calculated that a closing speed of nearly 600 miles per hour left enemy gunners with less than 3 seconds to fire accurately. To exploit this, specialized cannon installations were developed. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 G2 and Focke-Wulf A190A 5/U7 were armed with 30mm Mk108 cannons, weapons that could tear through a B-17 structure with a handful of hits. Luftwaffe instructors drilled their pilots to fire a single, precise burst and break away instantly. Entire Jagdgeschwader fighter wings practiced coordinated head-on pass attacks, diving through the formation in staggered waves. But the risks were immense. The closing speeds were so high that a slight misjudgment meant collision. Many German pilots were killed not by gunfire, but by ramming the very bombers they attacked. Zirkus Rosarius B-17, painted with black crosses, became the centerpiece of training demonstrations. Fighter groupmen were brought to observe mock engagements. Pilots studied the aircraft's blind spots, firing arcs, and turret behavior. They learned where to aim: the cockpit, the wing routes, or the bomb bay. Some Luftwaffe aces adapted quickly. Major Gunther Rahl, Walter Dahl, and Egon Meyer pioneered new tactics based on the Rechlin tests. Meyer's innovations were especially notable. He developed the Frontalangriff method, a disciplined formation attack that exploited the brief vulnerability of the B-17's nose before the introduction of the chin turret. His success was real, but short-lived. As the Americans upgraded their B-17s and introduced long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, the balance shifted again. Still, the German reports from 1943 bear a tone of reluctant respect. They often describe the bomber not as a machine to be despised, but as a formidable adversary that demanded ingenuity to overcome. The psychological and leadership angle, respecting the enemy's machine. Within the Luftwaffe's upper command, the captured fortress became a symbol of both admiration and anxiety. Reports circulated through the corridors of the RLM, the Reich Air Ministry, highlighting not just the bomber's defenses, but the philosophy behind its creation. To German officers, accustomed to the elegant minimalism of their own designs, the B-17 seemed almost excessive, heavy, overbuilt, saturated with systems, yet it worked, and that fact was deeply unsettling. During a technical conference in late 1943, one Luftwaffe engineer reportedly remarked, "It is not a plane, it is a factory of survival." His words encapsulated a growing realization that the Allied war effort was an industrial colossus. The B-17 was proof that the United States could build thousands of complex machines, each meticulously assembled, each crewed by men trained to identical standards. The Germans could capture one, perhaps two, but the sky above Europe swarmed with hundreds more. Pilots who flew the captured fortress returned to their squadrons with stories that bordered on disbelief. They described its sheer stability, the visibility from its cockpit, and the feeling of security within its armored shell. Some quietly admitted that if given the choice between their own He-111 and a flying fortress, they would choose the latter without hesitation. Even among those who fought it daily, there was respect. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Nock once wrote that the bomber formations resembled moving fortresses of steel and flame, and that shooting one down often felt less like victory and more like an act of futility. At the same time, the experience of facing the fortress hardened German resolve. The Luftwaffe leadership doubled down on developing countermeasures, upwards-firing cannon systems, Schragemusik, air-to-air rockets, R4M, and radar-guided interception methods. Each was an attempt to solve the same problem: how to defeat an enemy who could take more damage than they could inflict. And behind every technical challenge lay an unspoken truth: the Luftwaffe was losing its margin of innovation. As the Allies improved their bombers, Germany was forced into reactive design, chasing solutions instead of defining them. The B-17 had not just changed the aerial battlefield, it had shifted the psychology of warfare. It forced Germany to confront the limits of its own capacity, industrially, technologically, and strategically. By the end of 1943, Luftwaffe officers were openly acknowledging what few would have dared to admit a year earlier, that the American Flying Fortress represented a class of weapon Germany could not match. Even Theodor Rosarius, head of the test unit that bore his name, noted privately that the B-17 demonstrates the meaning of industrial warfare. It was, he said, the product of a nation that builds as it breathes. That quiet admission echoed through hangars and command rooms across Germany. The captured fortress had done more than reveal American engineering, it had revealed the scale of the struggle itself. And soon, the Luftwaffe would experience the full force of that realization, not in laboratories, but in the burning skies over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin. The study was over. The storm was coming.
By the summer of 1943, the theories and test flights were finished. The Luftwaffe knew what the B-17 could do and what it could withstand. Now came the true test, to face it not on paper, but in the skies over Germany. July brought the first great daylight raids deep into the Reich. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched hundreds of flying fortresses against the industrial arteries that kept Hitler's war machine alive. Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen. Names that would soon become synonymous with destruction and sacrifice. The German Fighter Command, armed with insights from Rechlin and Zirkus Rosarius, prepared for battle. They had trained for this moment using the captured fortress, studying its every angle, its every weakness. The Frontalangriff, head-on attack, would now be tested in combat. At dawn on August 17, 1943, the roar of engines filled English airfields as 376 B-17s began their journey toward Regensburg and Schweinfurt. It was one of the most ambitious missions yet attempted, a double strike designed to cripple both aircraft production and ball-bearing manufacturing, two pillars of the German war effort. The formations climbed to 25,000 feet, crossing the North Sea and entering hostile airspace. Over Germany, radar stations sounded the alarm. Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 26 scrambled their fighters. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s streaked upward to intercept the bombers as they approached their targets. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's new tactics, born from the study of that single captured B-17, would be unleashed. From high above, the German formations dove head-on into the approaching bombers. Cannon shells exploded through the formations, the sky lit with tracer fire, the air filled with fragments of aluminum and smoke trails. The Americans fought back with ferocious discipline. Gunners in the nose and chin turrets tracked the attacking fighters, firing long bursts of .5 caliber rounds. Some German planes disintegrated mid-air before even reaching firing distance. Others pressed their attack too close and collided with the bombers. Observers on the ground reported seeing entire formations of B-17s flying through curtains of flak and fighter attacks, their paths marked by smoke, yet still holding formation. One Luftwaffe pilot later said, "They flew on, even burning. We could not believe it." Despite heavy losses, the bombers reached their targets.
Regensburg's Messerschmitt factory erupted in flames. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants were shattered, but the cost was staggering. 60 bombers failed to return, over 600 men killed or captured. It was, in effect, a draw. The Luftwaffe had inflicted grievous losses, but at unsustainable cost to itself. Over 40 German fighters were destroyed that day, and more than 20 pilots, men the Reich could no longer replace, were lost. In Berlin, the Air Ministry analyzed the outcome with mixed emotions. The captured B-17 at Rechlin had revealed much, yet the battle had shown something far more profound, that no amount of tactical insight could overcome sheer numbers and determination. The Americans simply built more planes, more crews arrived, more formations filled the sky. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was running out of fuel, out of trained men, and out of time. Still, within the German command, the respect for the flying fortress grew. Officers began referring to the B-17 not as their Feind, the enemy, but as their Gegner, the opponent, a term implying respect between equals. For Luftwaffe test pilot Hans Werner Lerche, watching from Rechlin as reports came in, the meaning was clear. The bomber they had flown, studied, and admired was now defining the course of the air war. It was no longer a captured curiosity. It was the weapon rewriting the rules. Later that year, another captured B-17, this one a B-17G model with the new chin turret, arrived at Rechlin. When German engineers inspected it, they realized how rapidly the Americans were improving their design. Every lesson the Luftwaffe had learned was already being answered. The nose, once a vulnerability, was now bristling with guns. The formation defense pattern had been refined. The bombers carried radar, better oxygen systems, even improved armor. It was evolution in real time, industrial adaptation on a scale Germany could not match. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe's pilots had seen enough to know the truth. The B-17 was not invincible, but it was unrelenting. Every victory cost them dearly. Every downed fortress seemed to be replaced by two more. And above it all, the captured B-17 at Rechlin remained a silent witness, proof of both German skill and German limitation. The men who had once climbed into its cockpit out of curiosity now looked upon it with something deeper, the recognition that their enemy's strength came not just from machines, but from the industry, training, and endurance behind them. The next great battle, the second raid on Schweinfurt, would push both sides to their breaking point.
October 14th, 1943. The day would be remembered among American air crews as Black Thursday. At dawn, 291 B-17 flying fortresses lifted from their bases in eastern England. Their target once again, Schweinfurt, the beating heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry. The first raid in August had caused significant damage, but production had resumed. The U.S. 8th Air Force resolved to finish what it had started. But the Luftwaffe was ready. The lessons learned from the captured fortress and months of bloody experience had sharpened their response into a deadly machine. As the bombers crossed into enemy airspace, German radar screens lit up. Sirens wailed across airfields from Stuttgart to Frankfurt. Within minutes, more than 300 German fighters were climbing to intercept. Bf-109s, FW-190s, even twin-engine Zerstorer heavy fighters, all converging on the American formations. The sky over Germany soon became a storm of contrails, smoke, and fire. Luftwaffe pilots executed the newly refined Frontalangriff with chilling precision. Approaching it over 400 miles per hour, they fired short, concentrated bursts of cannon shells into the noses of the bombers before peeling away. Explosions tore through the leading formations. B-17s fell in flames, their crews bailing out into the cold October air. From inside the formations, gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Waist gunners shouted warnings over the intercom. Tail gunners tracked fighters diving through the formation. The thunder of engines, the crack of flak, and the rhythmic beat of machine guns merged into a single unending roar. Despite their losses, the bombers pressed on. Formation discipline, drilled endlessly in training, held them together. Damaged aircraft refused to break away. They stayed in line, knowing isolation meant death. At 2 p.m., the surviving fortresses reached Schweinfurt and dropped their bombs. Precision was impossible in the chaos, but the results were devastating. The ball-bearing factories were once again crippled. Then came the long flight home, 600 miles through hostile skies. Wave after wave of Luftwaffe fighters attacked during the withdrawal, exploiting their superior speed and climbing ability. Many damaged bombers fell behind and were picked off one by one. Others limped toward the channel, engines sputtering, control cables shot away. By the time the surviving B-17s reached England, 60 had been lost, nearly a quarter of the force. Hundreds of men were dead or captured. The cost was catastrophic. For the 8th Air Force, it was a victory bought with blood. For the Luftwaffe, it was proof that their tactics could still deliver punishment. But beneath the surface, both sides knew the truth. The German victory that day was tactical, not strategic. Each downed B-17 cost Germany irreplaceable fuel, ammunition, and pilots. The Luftwaffe could destroy planes, but not production lines. Within weeks, the American factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach had already replaced the lost bombers. New crews arrived daily. Inside Germany, the mood at Rechlin was complex. The captured B-17 still sat in its hangar, its engines occasionally run for further tests. Test pilot Hans-Werner Lerche recorded one of his final entries about the fortress that autumn. "We have flown it, studied it, and even fought it. It remains a machine that commands respect. Against such endurance, our courage is our only weapon." That statement captured the Luftwaffe's predicament perfectly. They could match American bravery, but not American production. Throughout 1944, as the U.S. introduced long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang, the tide of the air war shifted completely. The Mustang's arrival meant that German fighters could no longer attack the bombers with impunity. The hunters became the hunted. In the following months, Allied bombers began appearing over Berlin itself. The Reich's capital, once thought untouchable, now burned beneath the same aircraft the Luftwaffe had once flown in secret tests. The irony was heavy. The very bomber that had fascinated German engineers now signaled the beginning of their end. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's inspector of fighters, reportedly remarked to his aides after seeing the devastation of Berlin from above, "We learned their strengths too well, but knowledge does not build aircraft." He was right. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's fuel reserves were nearly gone. Pilots were being sent into battle with only a handful of training hours. The American bombers came in greater numbers than ever, escorted by squadrons of Mustangs sweeping the sky clean. The German airfields that once hosted Zirkus Rosarius were bombed repeatedly. Many of the captured Allied aircraft, including the B-17 DL+XC, were destroyed on the ground. When the Allies finally overran Rechlin in April 1945, they found only wreckage. The captured fortress lay twisted among the ruins of hangars and burned-out test planes, a silent relic of an experiment that had come full circle. To the Americans who discovered it, it was a curious sight. A B-17 bearing Luftwaffe markings, its frame riddled with shrapnel, its interior half-burned but still intact. One officer later wrote, "It looked tired, as if it had flown for both sides." In a way, it had. The Luftwaffe's encounter with the B-17 had begun as an exercise in study, and ended as an acknowledgement of defeat. The lessons they learned from flying it had refined their tactics, yes, but also revealed their own vulnerability. The fortress had done more than survive the war. It had outlasted those who sought to understand and destroy it. And from that wreckage, a new understanding of modern air power was born. The age of the flying fortress had proven one thing beyond question. In total war, the machine that endures, not the one that dazzles, decides the fate of nations.
When the smoke cleared over Europe, the air war had left behind not just ruins, but revelations. The B-17 flying fortress, once dismissed by many German officers as a slow, cumbersome machine, had become a symbol of what endurance, discipline, and industrial might could achieve. For the Luftwaffe, the lessons drawn from their captured fortress were profound and in many ways painful. The reports from Rechlin and Zirkus Rosarius became part of Germany's final technical archives. They revealed a grudging admiration for the enemy's engineering. The evaluations noted that the B-17's defensive coordination, redundancy, and crew survivability represented a design philosophy fundamentally different from anything produced in the Reich. The concept of overlapping defense, a formation that protected itself, fascinated Luftwaffe tacticians. They compared it to their own reliance on individual aircraft performance and pilot skill. German doctrine had always celebrated the lone ace, the man who outflew and outfought his enemies. The Americans had built a system that required no heroism to succeed, only cooperation. It was a staggering contrast. In one post-war interview, former Luftwaffe officer Rudolf Opitz reflected, "We thought war was fought by the best pilots. The Americans showed it was fought by the best factories." By 1944, as the Allies intensified their bombing campaign, the consequences of that industrial imbalance became inescapable. Germany's aircraft production lines, once efficient, were hammered day after day by the very machines they had studied. Plants at Augsburg, Regensburg, and Dessau, where the Luftwaffe's future designs were meant to rise, now lay in rubble. Among the engineers and pilots who had tested the captured fortress, many were reassigned to desperate defensive measures. Some were transferred to jet development programs, the Messerschmitt Me-262 and Arado AR-234. Others joined Erprobungskommando units, testing new weapons like the R-4M rocket designed to break up bomber formations. Yet none of these efforts could change the fundamental equation. The B-17's design had taught the Allies the value of endurance. It had also exposed Germany's dependence on precision and scarcity. By late 1944, the air war was no longer a contest. It was an inevitability. The U.S. 8th Air Force, now joined by the 15th from Italy, sent thousands of B-17s and B-24s over the Reich each month. Entire cities disappeared beneath waves of bombs. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and the loss of veteran pilots, could no longer mount effective resistance. Even the mighty flak guns that ringed German cities could not stem the tide. When American troops entered Germany in 1945, they encountered towns already shattered, skies empty of opposition, and airfields filled with the skeletons of once proud machines. At Rechlin, Allied investigators carefully examined what remained of Zirkus Rosarius. They found fragments of flight logs, testing photographs, and incomplete reports on the captured bombers. Among them, the records of the B-17 DL+XC, its modifications, flight hours, and evaluations. The documentation revealed an almost academic admiration for the aircraft. To American intelligence officers, it was an eerie discovery. The Luftwaffe had respected their bomber deeply, perhaps even envied it. One U.S. report summarizing the find noted, "Enemy evaluations confirmed that the B-17 achieved its design purpose.
It imposed attrition beyond the capacity of the Luftwaffe to replace. For the men who had flown it under the Black Cross, that realization had likely come much earlier. By war's end, most of Zirkus Rosarius's aircraft, including Spitfires, P-38s, and the famed Fortress, lay wrecked or captured. Their pilots faded into obscurity, their reports absorbed by post-war intelligence. Some of the engineers who had studied the B-17 later worked under Allied oversight, sharing what they had learned. Ironically, the exchange of knowledge would continue long after the fighting stopped. The idea of a heavily armed, durable bomber, one that prioritized crew survival and formation defense, influenced post-war designs in both East and West. Even Soviet engineers studying captured American bombers incorporated similar philosophies into early jet bombers like the Tu-4. The Flying Fortress had not just survived the war, it had shaped the peace that followed. But for the men of the Luftwaffe, its shadow lingered as a reminder of what they could not overcome, the power of a nation that could build endurance into metal and courage into design. And in the devastated hangars of Germany, the story of DL+XC, the fortress that flew for both sides, came to its quiet end.
When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the airfields that had once hummed with the sound of Daimler-Benz and BMW engines were quiet. The shattered remains of the Luftwaffe lay scattered across the fields of a ruined Reich. The Allies now controlled not just the land, but the sky, and the secrets that lay beneath it. Teams from the USARAF and RAF's Air Technical Intelligence units moved swiftly through captured German installations, collecting anything of value: engines, blueprints, radar systems, and aircraft fragments. At Rechlin, they found something else, a symbol of irony and respect. The remains of the captured B-17, its tail still bearing traces of the Luftwaffe's Black Cross. The aircraft had been stripped of usable parts, its fuselage scorched and twisted. But to the Allied investigators, it was more than wreckage. It was testimony. Proof that the enemy had studied the fortress closely, perhaps even admired it. In the archives recovered nearby, test reports described in detail how Luftwaffe officers had flown the American bomber. They documented its strengths, its ability to absorb damage, its gun layout, its control stability even under fire. The tone of the reports was professional, even reverent. One line stood out among the rest. The Boeing aircraft demonstrates resilience not achieved by our own types. To the Americans reading it, that statement was both vindication and elegy. Their Flying Fortress, designed a decade earlier in peacetime optimism, had outlasted every opponent, including those who had sought to learn from it. In the post-war years, the men who had once faced each other in the skies would often meet again under new flags. Many German engineers brought to the United States and Britain under Operation Paperclip and similar programs found themselves collaborating with their former adversaries. In those exchanges, the study of the B-17 resurfaced, not as a weapon, but as a lesson. The German focus on agility and performance merged with the American doctrine of endurance and redundancy. Together, these philosophies would define post-war aviation. The bombers that followed, the B-29, B-36, and later the B-52, carried echoes of the same design principle that had impressed the Luftwaffe so deeply. Survive the mission, no matter the cost. In Germany, those who had flown the captured B-17 faded into history. Hans-Werner Wertsche, one of the Luftwaffe's chief test pilots, survived the war and later worked as an engineer. In his memoirs, he briefly mentioned the Fortress, calling it an aircraft that did not fight for beauty or speed, but for life itself. It was an assessment born not of defeat, but of respect. Across the Atlantic, the legacy of the B-17 took on mythic proportions. Veterans spoke of it as a friend, a guardian in the sky.
Its crews remembered how it brought them home on 3 engines, or 2, or sometimes barely 1. They remembered the sound of its guns, the vibration of its frame, and the sight of the endless German sky filled with contrails and fire. In the decades that followed, historians pieced together the scattered records of Zirkus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's secret circus of captured aircraft. Among the photographs of Spitfires and P-38s stood one image of the B-17 with its mismatched insignia. The caption read simply, "Geflogen zur Erkenntnis," flown for understanding. That phrase captured the entire story in 3 words. The Luftwaffe had not flown the B-17 to boast or to deceive. They had flown it to understand, and in doing so had glimpsed the scale of what they were up against. It was not just the fortress's armor or its guns that overwhelmed them. It was what it represented, an industrial giant's relentless will made manifest in aluminum and steel. By the time Germany surrendered, that understanding had come too late to change anything. The flying fortress had done its work, not only as a weapon, but as a teacher. And in its silent, burned-out shell at Rechlin, it left behind a message that every nation would remember in the years to come. That in modern war, it is not the most daring who prevail, but the most enduring. The age of the Luftwaffe's aces was over. The age of the machines had begun. In the stillness after the storm, the story of the captured B-17 became more than a footnote in wartime history. It became a mirror, reflecting the contrast between 2 visions of warfare. The Luftwaffe had built its reputation on speed, precision, and the daring of individual men. The United States had built its war effort on endurance, production, and the belief that a machine could embody teamwork. When those 2 philosophies met in the skies over Europe, the outcome was inevitable. The B-17 Flying Fortress stood as the embodiment of that belief. It was not the fastest bomber, nor the largest, nor even the most advanced, but it was designed to endure, to bring its crew home, to take damage and keep flying, to fight not just with firepower, but with faith in its construction. When Luftwaffe officers climbed into that captured fortress and took it into the German sky, they were not just testing an aircraft, they were confronting an idea that industrial democracy could mass-produce courage. What they discovered in that cockpit was a kind of quiet genius. Systems built for resilience, design meant to protect life, and a philosophy that saw strength not in perfection, but in persistence. By war's end, the Luftwaffe's fascination with the fortress had turned into respect, and that respect into a reluctant admission. The Americans had built a machine that could not be stopped, only endured. Today, the few surviving B-17s that still take to the air carry more than just history in their wings. They carry the echo of those who flew them, on both sides, and the lesson their struggle left behind. That power lies not in the brilliance of a single pilot or engineer, but in the unity of purpose that turns thousands of hands and hearts into one unstoppable force. The captured B-17 at Rechlin may have been destroyed long ago, but its spirit endured. It whispered through the cold hangars, through the jet age that followed, and into every generation that studied the skies. Because in that war of steel and fire, the Luftwaffe learned one final humbling truth: that no weapon in the world is more formidable than the will to endure.